Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and The Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Carmen, who's an advanced photographer from Canada. Carmen says he made this image after meeting this man in downtown Toronto. Says this gentleman barely spoke English, but they were able to communicate, and he asked to take his photograph, and this gentleman was hesitant at first, but as they spoke a little bit more, he became more comfortable, and Carmen was allowed to make some portraits. Carmen says he shot this with a Canon 40D with a 28mm lens, stopped down to f4 and exposed the file for 2/50th of a second. One of the first things I wanted to mention in the critique today is just a technical thing connected to equipment. Carmen is working here with a crop factor camera, so the effective focal length is actually pretty close to 50mm normal focal length. And if you're going to do this kind of photography in the street where you actually approach people first and you want to shoot head and shoulders portraits or just faces, to me the 50 is a really great lens for that kind of work. And I like it for several different reasons. Number one, the 50 is going to sort of require you to get close to make this kind of a tight portrait. You're going to be in very close, and I personally like being in that close because my idea about doing street photography is to first make a connection with people, to talk to them and build rapport and spend time with them. That's sort of the intent behind what I'm doing. And the second thing I love about the 50 is even when you come in really close with a lens and shoot a face, there tends to be very little perspective distortion. In other words, the face ends up looking pretty close to the way that it looks when you're there seeing it. And the other thing I love about the 50 is it's still wide enough to allow you to get some background, to put the person in a context, or to work with background as a design element in the image. And there are lots of other things about the 50 I like. We could keep going, but those are the main takeaways I would mention. Another technical thing that connects to one of the things I like about this image is with Carmen being this close, with this effective focal length and shooting pretty wide open at f4, there's a really nice flow of focus here. So one of a whole grouping of things that we can do to get a portrait subject to separate from the background. Sharp on the face, but a fall off of focus on the background, creating some nice separation. One of the main things I love about this image is something that to me is the most important part of photographing people, and that is the idea of expression and gesture. And the expression here is very powerful with this person looking right at us, almost in a confrontational way. And then when you add the cigarette in the mouth and the mouth sort of being closed, the head straight up and down, very, very direct energy that comes to me as the viewer from this portrait. That's really powerful. I'm also really enjoying the background. It's simple, but it's also doing a really beautiful job in terms of the texture of rhyming the character in this man's face. And because it looks like sort of a granite block wall design, that graphic pattern of the block is beautifully rhyming the man's coat and the pattern of the plaid and the coat. I'm really enjoying that part of the image. And the other thing that I really like here, it looks like, it'd be interesting to hear from Carmen about this, that Carmen's using a little bit of an HDR effect, and I think that it's been used here very beautifully. You can see the quality of the light is very hard. Brightest part of the day, the shadow's coming straight down. Carmen still has this really beautiful detail and local contrast in what should really be, from a traditional photography standpoint, a very, very deep shadow. And I'm really enjoying the way Carmen has managed this in his post-processing. There's sort of an electric feeling to local contrast and an overall feeling of beautiful contrast, even though we know that this has been shot in hard light. When I start to think about perfect world improvement for this image, there are two basic things I think about. For me, this part of the background becomes very different. It's brighter, the texture and the feeling of form goes away, and the block pattern seems to go away. And so even though it's a background element, because it's different than the rest of the background, this becomes a pretty dominant idea. And I'd like to just grab information from over here and blend it in so that this remains a background element and doesn't start to come forward because it's different. And the other thing just has to do with a background in color theory and trying to continue to make this part of the image, the face and this real powerful expression, to be even more powerful. For me, what's happening from a color theory standpoint right now is that because the wall is so warm, it harmonizes the face. And that does create visual unity from the portrait subject to the background. But in my opinion, we have to sort of be careful how we play with the idea of unity and harmony, because if this starts to become an idea that is just as powerful from a color standpoint, in this case because of the quantity of it, as the color and the main subject, then literally what can happen is that the face can visually in some respects become a part of the background, and now what's coming forward are these areas that are more black and white and more graphic. And I'd like to actually flip that on itself. I'd like to make this part go more towards a black and white graphic so that the face, and from a color standpoint, is the most exciting idea. And it's also going to bring up something we haven't talked about that's very powerful in the image. This person's eyes look to be sort of blue or blue-green. And because of this very direct gaze, the idea of sort of steely blue eyes, and with the pupils being constricted because of the real bright light, that's also leading to this feeling of us sort of just being looked at in a very pointed way. That's going to come forward more, this color relationship, if this starts to harmonize the clothes. And the other thing that's going to happen is as this harmonizes the clothes, then the clothes start to become more of a background element as they become like the background. And this really is left to sort of stand on its own and really come forward. So here's the work. I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly. Here's the layer where I've taken information from the right hand side and I copied it and then used a layer mask in a pretty rough way, but just to show you what that might look like, how it simplifies the background. And then a series of moves here to make the color on the wall not only go away, but to more closely harmonize the jacket and the hat. And I'm also in here going to add more saturation to the face. There's a hue saturation to desaturate the wall. There's a curves layer where I'm using the white balance dropper to get even more of the warm out. Then I'm going to darken all the way around. That makes the portrait subject come forward as the framing device gets darker, difference between light and dark. Then I'm going to saturate the face. The saturation comes forward relative to the more monochrome feeling around the face. Then I'm going to push the color more towards sort of a reddish kind of blue. It's very subtle, but watch what happens. It's going to play more off of the jacket. You're going to see a little bit more yellow come out, and what warm is there move towards sort of this color that plays off of this color, sorry about that, plays off of the color right here. There's a blue and the black, and then there's red, and it's real subtle, but it's just a color theory thing that I'm trying to play off with to make that wall more like the jacket. And then I added even more saturation to the face, and then at this point I felt like these two ideas were too dominant, and I came in and I turned down the contrast and value. Here's where we started, and here's where we've ended up. And I could see somebody making a case for cropping this from the right to get rid of this high contrast area right here. And it does simplify things some, but for me it starts to make this a little bit too much of a one note. I like having more background in this image, and here's why, just very, very quickly. That idea right here really plays off of this is a real dominating idea, this shadow, and then the center of the face, the nose, and the cigarette. All that's happening on a diagonal, and this kind of ping-pongs off of these high contrast or dominating ideas. And with the gaze being this direct, having an area where I can sort of go and get out of that gaze, but then having a design element over here that plays on the diagonal to push me or ping-pong me back to these ideas, to me, makes the whole thing live and breathe a little bit more and gives me more of a chance to stay with this and stay inside of the image. Boy, I love this. I love what Carmen's done here. First, just kudos to Carmen for having the courage to do this kind of photography. And people that have been following me for a while now know that I'm a big advocate of doing this kind of work. There's a story that a lot of photographers are in when it comes to this kind of work. One, there's an enormous amount of fear about doing this kind of work, and the other story that people are in is there's this idea that we'll impose on people if we approach them on the street. And my experience over the course of the last 5 years doing this work is that the exact opposite is true. We're really trying to just protect ourselves from leading a more rich life, and when you share with other people your joy as a photographer, and part of your intention is to connect. I know this is going to sound sappy and over the top, but it's happened in my own life. Miracles literally happen. It may not happen the first time that you meet somebody. They might even say no, but you're planting seeds of consciousness where you're taking a chance, you're reaching out, and the rewards for that, if it just becomes a way that you live as a photographer, it's not about these accomplishments, and yes, I got this person to say yes, and yes, I made this great portrait. It just becomes a habit. It's pretty amazing all the different gifts that can come to you as an artist as a result of these kinds of interactions. A really awesome portrait from Carmen, and want to say a big thank you to him, and I hope to see you again soon on the Mindful Eyes Daily Critique.